What's up, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls around the world? I would like to welcome you back to the Real Talk with Zuby podcast. On today's episode, we have got on a stand-up comedian. He's also one of the co-hosts of the Triggernometry podcast, which I was featured on a couple of months ago. And this is my friend and former schoolmate, Konstantin Kisin. Welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me, man.
It's an honor. So I've just done a very quick intro of you right there. So why don't you explain to the audience who you are?
Well, as you said, I'm a stand-up comedian. I'm originally from Russia. I came to this country when I was 13 years old, and I've lived here since. In addition to doing stand-up, we have the Triggernometry podcast that you mentioned that you've been on. And the point of that is to have conversations that are honest with interesting people with no filters. So we get in people who have something interesting to say. Often people have something controversial to say, or people who've been controversial like you, or have done something like that. And we try and just get to the bottom of some of the most difficult issues that are kind of part of the debate right now, what you might call the culture war, whether it's the gender pay gap. We bring on an economist to talk about what are some of the causes of that. Or we've had evolutionary psychologists on the show, people like Diana Fleischman, Jeffrey Miller, to talk about, what are the differences between men and women? Why is it not right to have a female fighter fighting a trans woman in a cage? What are some of the biological differences there? All kinds of stuff like that, really. So we're really interested in what's happening in society now, and what we felt when we started the show was that these conversations are not being had honestly. We're not having these conversations in a way that reflects the reality. So just take the issue that you became particularly known for with the whole trans thing, right? Is we had a national debate on Good Morning Britain with people actually genuinely discussing if there are physical differences between men and women.
Mm-hmm. I've had some of those conversations myself. I mean, one of the interviews I did on BBC, the title of the conversation was, "Do biological men have a strength advantage over women in sport?" That was the debate topic, which, I mean, obviously I was there and I gave my honest opinions, and well, not opinions, facts. And it was just sort of in the back of my mind, it was just amazing to me that this was even a conversation. Because it's, we can always clash over opinions and things that are gray areas, but there are some things which are black and white. And, facts do exist. 2 + 2 does equal 4. No matter how much I want to feel it may equal 3 or equal 5 or 7, it does equal 4. And we live in this world where not opinions, emotions and feelings and even ideologies are trumping facts in some cases, which is a little bit concerning. So one thing I wanted to ask you about was I want to kind of take it way back. So you said you came to the UK when you were 13, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your life. Tell us about tell us about you and what has led to the stage where the Triggernometry podcast even exists and you even getting into stand-up comedy. I'd like to know your story.
Well, this is one of the things that I find so interesting because it ties into exactly what we're talking about. Because I grew up in a society where essentially my parents would have to have a conversation with me when I was a 7-year-old going to school about what I could and couldn't say in school that we might discuss privately in the home. Because if you said the wrong thing as a kid in the Soviet Union where I grew up, your parents would be in trouble. They might be arrested, they might be interrogated, they might lose their job, they might, in previous decades, not in my parents' time, but previously, they might get sent to the gulag, they might be executed, right? So we lived in exactly that society, which is what George Orwell wrote about, where you had to, at some point, hold publicly, at least, the opinion that 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah.
And if you didn't do that, there would be very, very severe consequences. So growing up, that was always something that was at the back of my mind. And in fact, my grandfather, my father's father, he was actually exiled from the Soviet Union for basically saying the wrong thing.
Right? Okay. So what were the specific things? So I hear stories about the Soviet Union. I've done a little bit of reading about it, not as much as I plan to. But now that those repercussions are no longer there, what are some of the things that your parents, for example, would say to you as a kid? Like, okay, you can't say this in public, or you can't talk about this with your friends in school? Like, can you give a couple sort of general examples?
Well, the thing with the Soviet Union was essentially a completely rotten society. It was riddled with corruption. You would not be promoted in work based on merit. You would be promoted in work based on who you paid a bribe to, on who your contacts were, whose nephew you were, and stuff like that, right? So it was a society that was riddled with corruption at every level, from the very
Mm.
top to the very bottom. But if you were to say that, the notion of the Soviet Union was it was this egalitarian society where everybody was equal, everybody had equal right, everybody had equal opportunity. So if anyone criticized that or make a joke about it or pointed out some of the hypocrisies of that society in any way, you would be in trouble.
Mm.
And the reason that the Soviet Union had to have this oppressive police state and had to have the secret police and had to put people in prison is there was a system that was fundamentally flawed. It was a system that would take away from the capable and give it to the people who were less capable or less hardworking, and it didn't work because human beings don't work that way.
Yeah.
You know, if you say to people that you don't get rewarded for your effort, and someone else gets rewarded for a lack of effort, that is a society in which no one makes an effort.
Mm.
So it was a society that was riddled with these contradictions. And the reason that they had to suppress freedom of expression and they had to suppress freedom of speech and they had to prevent people from speaking out or even making jokes about these things is that essentially the act of somebody publicly challenging it would be so revolutionary because everyone already agreed with the challenge. Everyone
Mm.
knew it was a flawed society.
Sounds familiar.
You're right. Well, this is my point. This is my point. This is why I'm so worried about what's happening in the West now, because it's exactly like your example or the example with me and SOAS that we might get into is anyone who says something that we all know to be true must be silenced
Mm.
because what they're saying is true, because we know it's true. It's not that they must be silenced because what they're saying is hateful or dangerous for that reason. They must be silent precisely because we all know that what they're saying is true. So in the Soviet Union, making a joke about the stupidity of the communist system or about a leader of the communist system or just anything, saying
Mm.
anything critical of the government or of the structure in which we lived was automatically something for which people would be punished. I mean, during Stalin times, I know personally of people whose families were persecuted and put in the gulag for the fact that they wrapped chips, potato chips, in a newspaper which had Stalin's face on it.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Yikes.
So, or there was a whole newspaper editorial team was shot within 24 hours because they misspelled a headline which was about Stalin. So it was this massive personality cult under Stalin, but it was a broader thing. It
Mm.
was about suppressing people's opinions. It was about keeping everyone in a climate of fear, so that it wasn't so much that the rules of what you could and couldn't say were very clear. They were quite deliberately unclear, so that you never knew where you stand, so
Yeah.
that you would be extra careful about what you did and could and couldn't say. Again, sounds familiar.
Wow. So here's a question. So at the time you were growing up, I mean, what was the actual system like? So before the collapse of the Soviet Union, when it was still intact, I mean, so obviously your family was living there, your parents were working there. I mean, how did the system actually work? So were they working, were they employed directly by the government, or how did it actually work? Like, what are the details of it?
Everybody was employed directly by the government. In the
Mm.
Soviet Union, there was no such thing as private enterprise.
Okay.
In fact, private enterprise was a crime.
Yeah.
So if you opened up a lemonade stand, that was counter-revolutionary activity for which you could go to the gulag for 25 years,
Yeah.
because you were sabotaging the socialist system,
Mm.
which said that the government told you what to do in every respect. So you would go to school, you would
Mm.
get your grades, you would go to university. Let's say you studied physics or IT. We didn't have IT at the time, but let's say you studied physics, right?
Yeah.
Once you graduate, the government would decide not only which job you did, but where you did the job.
Mm.
So, for example, my father went to university in Moscow, and on graduating as a chemical engineer, he was sent to Uzbekistan
Okay.
to work on a nuclear power plant there. And
Mm.
he had no choice in that. So you could be sent from one corner of the country to another purely because that is what the government had decided needed to happen.
Yeah. And what about the taxes and the redistribution? I mean, was it even Was there still direct income tax, or was it just like how did the distribution take place?
You know what? It's
Do you
odd
know?
because I actually don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure. I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing here, but
No, that's okay.
um, I don't remember taxes ever being discussed in the
Hmm.
Soviet Union. You just had the salary that you had. It was not negotiable, right? So
Yeah.
it was a grade of salary across the whole country, and that is what you would be paid.
Okay.
And I suspect the taxes would have been withheld directly from
Hmm.
that. But also, there is not so much need to tax people because if the government employs everybody, then the product that
It's
is generated goes straight to the government.
yeah, that's what I
Uh,
was intrigued by because I know obviously what communism is on a high level, but as someone who actually did live in
hmm,
that system for your childhood, I'm just wondering like what were the mechanisms? You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like that's
yeah,
something
yeah.
I'm gonna have to read up a little bit more on. So coming forward a little bit, so you came to school in the UK.
Hmm,
Obviously, we actually went to the same boarding school together, so that's where we first met. For anyone curious, we were actually even in the same boarding house. So
yeah.
we were living in the same building for
Hmm,
several years.
hmm.
So talk us through what that was like, what it was like first coming to the UK, and then I guess afterwards everything that's led you to eventually becoming a stand-up comic. A stand-up comic because I'm not actually. We sort of had a. It's interesting how after school finished, we sort of lost touch with each other for over a decade.
Mm.
And then we sort of came back in touch via Twitter, and I think you were like, "Oh, look, Zuby's a rapper. Oh, Konstantin's a comedian. Like, how's this happened?"
Yeah.
So, yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, actually, before I do that, let me just
Okay.
to talk about the Soviet Union a little bit more because I
Yeah,
think
go for
it's
it.
something people don't really know. There was no private property in the Soviet Union, right? So you could not have an apartment or a flat or a house.
Mm,
It was very unusual for people to be able. Some of them kind of managed to hold on to their house from pre-revolutionary times, but generally speaking, if you wanted a place to live, you would be allocated one by the state.
okay.
If you wanted a car, you would be allocated one by the state. There would be a 5-year waiting period, right?
Wow.
And when I talk earlier about corruption, you can immediately see why corruption would exist. Because if things are allocated to you, not on the basis of, I did this job on my merit, I got this much money on the merit, now I go to the shop and I buy something, but
Hmm.
rather you got allocated things by people who had the power in their hands, some kind of administrator somewhere, a decision maker,
Hmm.
then the market economy still creeps into it. It's just the money doesn't go to the shop; it goes to the crooked administrator.
Yeah, yeah.
The concept of not private, no private property, I think, would be quite alien to many people. So it was interesting because what happened with me is when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a time of tremendous opportunity. It was a very difficult time for many people, but it was a time for tremendous opportunity. And my dad, because of my grandfather speaking out and being exiled from the Soviet Union, his whole family were affected by this. He was fired from his job. His wife was fired from her job. My dad and his sister were kicked out of university.
Hmm.
And this was right before the Soviet Union collapsed. So my dad kind of started a little small business right on the as the Soviet Union was collapsing, and then him and his friends started another business, and then eventually they founded Russia's first bank.
Oh,
Just
wow.
just like that.
Okay.
That's kind of how things worked back then, which sounds crazy, right? They didn't really have any money to do it properly, but that was how things were. You just kind of did stuff and saw what worked.
Yeah, I
Uh,
imagine it must have been a very destabilizing time for
hugely.
people. I mean, because even if that system beforehand wasn't good, it's like it's been there for several decades. People have grown up in it. People are used to it, and then suddenly this thing collapses, and it's like, well, firstly, you've got new independent countries essentially,
Mm.
but then you've also got people who it's like, oh, now you can start a business. Now you can hire people. Um, what was that transition like?
Well, you see, the thing with that is that for some people it was an opportunity, but for the vast majority of people, it was a huge loss.
Yeah.
Because imagine that you've been studying all your life to become a scientist, which was one of the most well-paid and respected professions in the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
And then the Soviet Union collapses, and suddenly Russia is just trying to find its feet. Doesn't need scientists,
Yeah.
and you've lost everything overnight. So you had people who'd spent 20 years trying to make a career as a scientist, overnight becoming beggars, selling their
Wow.
furniture on the streets. It was. all the safety and comfort and stability
Mm.
that people had disappeared overnight.
Yeah.
And if you think about what's happened in Russia since, with Vladimir Putin taking over from Boris Yeltsin and being in power for 20 years now,
Hmm.
right? That is a direct reaction to people going, oh my God, life is not certain. Things are not stable. Let's
Mm.
get in a strongman who can actually stabilize this thing.
Yeah. So that
And
makes that context makes his popularity certainly in Russia. I mean, there's it's almost like there's two views of Putin, right? There's the way the people in Russia seem to view him, which a lot of it does seem to be genuine, not that they're being, forced to view him this way. And then the sort of global or Western view where he's considered, much more of a villainous figure
mm.
rather than a hero. But in given that context, it makes a lot more sense why you just want this strong, very stable figurehead, to give that sense of security and predictability.
Well, think about your own life. If you had the sense that tomorrow everything you have could be wiped away and disappear, and you would be on the street and your children would be starving,
Mm.
your concern for democracy would be considerably less than
Yeah,
it is now. So in some ways, democracy is it's a product of a successful society, a stable society in a way.
gotcha.
So anyway, so my dad was in this position where there was opportunity, and he made quite a lot of money very quickly. So he was able to send me to boarding school in England.
Hmm.
I didn't speak any English when I came, so it was a couple of years of very hard adaptation. I couldn't really make friends. It was quite. This was before you came to the school, by the way,
Sure. Yeah.
so you wouldn't have caught this. But yeah, it took me a couple of years to really get a sense of how it is and understand the culture a bit more. But I really enjoyed boarding school because what I felt like it was a place where um, ultimately you were given so many opportunities to try so many different things. Whether that's if horse riding or shooting or debating or whatever, golf or whatever, or rugby or football or whatever, that you didn't have to be good at all of them.
Yeah.
You didn't even have to be good academically. As we know, the most popular cool kids at school were not the ones who were good at maths or economics or whatever.
Mm.
If you could be good at something, you would be recognized for that and you would be rewarded for that. Right. So in my case, it was debating. In my case, it was certain sports that I played. And it gave you a sense of confidence in yourself because you got a chance to discover quite an early age that actually there are some things you're good at.
Yeah.
And I think that is the one thing that, I mean, you talk about privilege, that is the genuine privilege that if you go to boarding school that you have the chance to try enough things to find out the thing that you're actually good at. Whereas if you go to a school where, the opportunities you have are to do the normal academic subjects and maybe to play football,
Hmm.
and let's say you're not good at any of those, then you haven't had that confidence boost from an early age where you've had an opportunity to go, oh wow, I'm actually good at something, or
Yeah.
maybe I should make some. So for me, for example, debating, we had these debating competitions and stuff at school.
Yeah. I
That was
remember.
one of the things I really enjoyed, and I don't think it's a surprise that I now host a YouTube show. I'm a stand-up comedian. I go on TV and debate people about stuff. It's part of that. I kind of had that sense that this is what I can do.
Yeah.
um, yeah, so that was school, and then I went to university in Edinburgh. And right at that moment, my father got into a lot of trouble in Russia. It was a very volatile time, so there were a lot of power plays and power moves. And my dad, by that point, was a minister in Boris Yeltsin's government.
Oh,
Boris
okay.
Yeltsin was Russia's first president. And the way, how like British or American politics works now is if you want to take someone down, you take a quote that they said on Twitter 7 years ago and you misrepresent
Yeah.
it. And then, back then in Russia, it was very different. You would fabricate some kind of false allegation against the person, and you would get police who were on your payroll to come and arrest them or take them away or something like that. So that's basically what happened to my dad, and he had to flee Russia under false identity.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and for 10 years he had to live under false identity. He couldn't go back. And the reason was actually very interesting because when the police came to our house, they seized some like a bunch of cash, my mother's jewelry, my father's really expensive watch and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And the person who organized this false allegation against my dad, he had absolutely no power within about 2 years. He himself had been completely destroyed 2 years later.
Yeah.
But for some reason, the police wouldn't close the case against my dad, even though it was completely fabricated. And it was only about 8 or 9 years later that through my dad's lawyer,
Hmm.
he worked out that the reason they couldn't close the case was that they had all these valuables in an evidence locker. Right. Like,
Hmm.
when you in this country, if you get arrested, the police come and seize your stuff, they
Sure.
put it in an evidence locker.
Yeah.
Well, that stuff wasn't in an evidence locker anymore. The watch,
Ah.
the money, the everything, it'd been gone. It was
Yeah.
gone. It was been spent. And so that's why they wouldn't close the case. And eventually when my dad said to him, look, just forget about that stuff,
Yeah.
they closed the case. So right as I was at university, halfway through university, paying these huge foreign student fees,
Mm.
my dad went from being essentially a millionaire to having nothing.
Ah. Wow.
So this is one of the reasons that when we talk about privilege, it pisses me off tremendously, because it's like, where do you want to draw the cutoff line?
Mm.
I've lived in a mansion, I've lived in a park,
Yeah.
right? Do you want to take the day before I had to live in a park for 3 weeks because I had no money?
Yeah.
Because then I'm super privileged.
Hmm.
I've had all the privilege in the world. Or do you want to take it right as I'm sleeping in the park, and
Yeah.
and then I have no privilege and I'm whatever?
The craziest thing about the current privilege conversation is that it's not even generally based on socioeconomic factors, which would at least make a little bit more sense. You see what I mean?
Mm,
So I'll be the first to tell somebody that I'm privileged, right? Like I said on my very first album, I had a lyric saying, I'm a privileged kid, yo, just state in the facts so you can get a better picture, see it clearly like context. Like I
mm,
put that out there. I'm like, yeah, look, I'm at Oxford University. I went to boarding school. Like I've never, wondered where my next meal is coming from or had to be homeless or anything like that. I recognize plenty of people have been through that. And so yeah, I'm like, yeah, I don't check my privilege per se, but I'm like, I'm not, if someone's like, oh, I'm like, yeah, okay. And what? You know what I mean? It's like that in itself is not a point, but it's weird where we've reached the stage where it's not even about class or wealth or anything like that. It's someone will just look at me and be like, oh, you're black. This person is white. This person has white privilege. So you must be some sort of oppressed. And I'm like, dude, I'm so much better off than the vast majority of white people in the UK, let alone in the world, right? I can walk outside and almost every person I see that's homeless is a white male,
mm,
right? And what's it called? The apex fallacy, where people will look at the very top of something. So they'll say, oh, well, most CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are white males, but they'll never look at the bottom and see that actually in those same societies, the people who are worst off by many measures in terms of homelessness, drug use, alcoholism, poverty, suicide rates, deaths, those are also primarily certainly male and often the case white male as well. So it's a very selective, it's like a very selective and convenient way of looking at certain factors to try to make the point. And beyond all that, it's just the whole concept is garbage. I mean, it's not helpful. I know we discussed this when I was on the show. That's the
mm.
thing, is it's not helpful. Like I don't see, okay, even if we accept all of this stuff, it's like, okay, well, now what? You've made these people feel bad about themselves for something that they haven't done. And like, what now?
Yeah, well, I think the thing you and I are both talking about essentially is it's almost like judging people by the color of the skin is a really bad idea.
Yeah. Lo and behold.
I wish somebody had said that about 50 years ago. Uh, yeah, so I've kind of had both experiences. I've been incredibly privileged,
Mm,
and I've been incredibly poor and starving and all the rest of it. So yeah, and then I had to drop out of university. I never got to finish my degree. I had to start my own business, so I started a translation business. It was really the only two skills I had. I knew two languages, and I kind
mm,
of understood finance and economics a little bit from the studies that I'd done. And I did that for 10 years, and then I got really bored, and I felt like I actually have something to say.
okay.
And I remember watching people like George Carlin and Bill Hicks and people like that who were stand-up comedians who were not just saying something funny, but actually trying to make a point
Mm,
as well, and challenging the mainstream narrative in society. And that's why I got into stand up about 3.5, 4 years ago.
mm.
Um,
Oh,
I've been
how did you do that? What was the process? What was your first gig? How did you write your first stuff, and what was that like?
Well, yeah, I'm trying to remember. So I think the first gig I did like an introduction to comedy, like half a week workshop or something, where they
Hmm.
teach you like the very basics of like don't do this, don't do that, stand like this, hold the microphone like that. Here's how you might want to think about writing a joke. And at the end of that, it's like a showcase with your friends and family. They're all very supportive for your
Hmm.
terrible jokes. You go and do your absolutely horrendous jokes, and they're like, "Yeah, this is brilliant." So
Yeah.
you walk off stage and you go, "Oh, I'm amazing. I'm going to be great at this." And then you go out into the real world, and you turn up like at an open mic night when it's you and 10 other equally disinterested comedians. There's no actual audience. It's just other comics.
Mm.
Um, and it's pretty brutal. The first year or two is absolutely brutal because those are the hardest gigs you actually probably ever do,
Yeah.
because you're
It's the
performing.
same in music.
Is it?
Yeah, well, so, not to that sense, but as in it's harder at the beginning
Mm,
when nobody knows you, nobody is there for you, nobody is on your side, and whatever. It's it's much easier to perform for a crowd that already knows you and loves you and wants to sing along to your songs than it is to win over a crowd who's neutral or maybe even somewhat hostile, who's kind of just looking at you like, not almost like they don't want to like it, they don't want to laugh at your jokes, they don't want to clap at the music, and you're kind of there like, man, I need to win these people over. That's a lot harder than performing for fans.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so you spend your first couple of years just grinding it out. But the thing is, you're really not very good in your first couple of years either.
Mm.
So it's kind of your audience matches your skill level,
Yeah.
and as your skill level goes up, hopefully your audiences and the gigs you get to play improve as well. So I feel like I've made a lot of progress, and particularly in the last couple of years, I'm playing some of the biggest clubs in the UK now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm doing my own show at the Edinburgh Fringe this year about some things that have happened recently. Yeah, it's going well, and I've always been very keen to use comedy as a way to talk about what I think is happening in society.
Mm.
I think I can't remember whose quote it is, but it's a brilliant quote about how comedy is kind of kind and pessimistic. In other words, comedy feels like, well, we can't change anything, therefore we might as well laugh about it.
Mm.
Whereas satire is angry and optimistic,
Okay. Yeah.
where you think, well, things are wrong, but we can actually change them. And here's me kind of saying, this is what needs to change.
Mm.
And I always tend towards satire. I do comedy as well, obviously, but I always, my brain always leans towards satire. I always feel like we can do better.
Yeah. So so coming up into the time where we're at now, I mean, in the last couple of months, I have seen you by, not so much by the media itself, but by some people who you've been debating with in the media, or some other people who are well-known figures. I mean, you've been decried as being anything from alt-right to a Nazi to a soy boy
Yeah.
to um I don't know, like a liberal, like, so so of all these labels that have been thrown at you, many of which cancel each other out. I know, I think you've defined yourself many times as being a centrist.
Yeah.
So where have these labels come from, and how do you define yourself? What are the misconceptions there?
Well, let's start at the beginning. So
Yeah.
about 6 months ago, I was offered to perform. Some students saw me performing in a comedy club, and they liked my stuff, so they invited me to perform at their university in London.
Hmm.
And in doing so, they said they wanted to create a safe space for comedy.
Which doesn't exist, but yeah.
So they sent me a contract, which they called, rather terrifyingly, a behavioral agreement form, which said that in the interest of creating the safe space for comedy, they have a zero tolerance policy on racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-religion, anti-atheism. And it said that all jokes must be respectful and kind.
I love that. I love that. That's actually sounds like it's from a dystopian novel. It's brilliant.
Yeah, so I turned it down. I tweeted about it, and it became quite a big news story around the world. As you know, I was on Piers Morgan here in the UK, Tucker Carlson. It was all the newspapers worth the name, as well as the Guardian. Within about 24 hours, a mental woman, a radical feminist called Kate Smurthwaite, called me a Nazi on national radio.
She's supposed to be a comedian, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've seen her being really angry on some shows before, but I've never gotten like a glimpse of comedy from her. But maybe I'll need to check that out.
I have actually gigged with her a few times.
Okay.
I have never seen her be particularly funny, but hey, I don't like to go after comedians.
No, do I.
But anyway, she called me an all right. She essentially called me a Nazi, which has been absolutely brilliant for me, because I now have a niche.
Mm-hmm.
I am the only Jewish Nazi comedian in the world.
Yeah, who grew up in the Soviet Union too.
Right. Yeah.
just to add to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got all those skinhead synagogue gigs to myself, man. I'm crushing that circuit right now. Yeah. So that happened, and then in the last couple of weeks, as you mentioned, a genuinely far right personality here in the UK called Katie Hopkins called me a soy boy on Twitter.
In a t-shirt.
Soy boy in a t-shirt. Right. I'm wearing a shirt now.
I love the in a t-shirt, because I saw that and I was like, what was he supposed to wear? Like, why the t-shirt?
Yeah. Well, there's something wrong with t-shirts apparently. Which is interesting, because I looked up the definition of soy boy, and one of the defining features of a soy boy is someone who calls everyone else Nazis.
Yeah.
So having been called a Nazi myself, I found that quite interesting.
Yeah.
But anyway, so maybe, I don't know, if they're both right, I guess I'm no threat to anyone, because even if I am genuinely evil, I am too weak to do anything about it. You know what I mean? So yeah, but I kind of think if both of the extremes are attacking you, you're probably somewhere in the middle, which is genuinely where I am. I have some left-wing beliefs. I have some beliefs that are center-right. But broadly speaking, I would say I'm quite a reasonable person. I mean, look at even something like Brexit, which is a big issue here in the UK.
Yeah.
I voted Remain, but I have a lot of sympathy for many people who voted Leave.
Yeah.
And I try to come at things with a kind of understanding that, broadly speaking, human beings are not evil. The vast majority of people are eminently reasonable, eminently in the middle, are willing to hear both sides of the argument, which is kind of why we started Triggernometry. We wanted to talk to and hear the opinions of people that we may not necessarily agree with, or may not necessarily hear a lot in the media.
Yeah. Well, so what was it exactly that led to you wanting to start that podcast? Like, I know why I started mine, but was there a particular incident, or at what stage were you just like, okay, we need to do something about this? Was there like a certain moment?
Yeah, I think it was the Trump and Brexit thing, particularly Brexit, because I'm an immigrant in this country. I've lived here for over 20 years. And what happened when Brexit happened, it was essentially people deciding that half of the country are these racist xenophobes that hate immigrants. And I just went, I mean, I am pro-Remain, and I'm not happy that Brexit happened. That's how I felt at the time. But I know for a fact that half of the people in this country are not racist xenophobes.
No.
I know that.
Yeah.
From my own experience, from talking to other people, from ethnic minority groups, from immigrant communities. I know that.
Yeah.
So something is wrong here. So let's talk to some people who voted Brexit, who are experts in this thing, and find out why it is. And then once you take a little peek into that wormhole, you suddenly go, oh wait, maybe the gender pay gap isn't all about discrimination, or maybe white privilege isn't as simple as people make it out to be.
Okay, so what were your position on some of those things before you started having these conversations?
Well, my position was the general kind of lefty liberal position, which is, don't hurt anyone, try and be nice. Everyone who voted Brexit is an idiot. Women are oppressed, all this kind of stuff.
Okay.
And then when you start to look at the facts, because I've always been fascinated by truth, I've been obsessed with truth because I lived in a society where truth was verboten. It was forbidden. Yeah. And saying the truth would get you in trouble. So once I started to look at the facts and talk, we've had Kay Andrews on the show, who's a well-known economist, talking about breaking down the causes of the gender pay gap. We've had evolutionary psychologists explaining that, for example, lesbians make more money than straight women, right? So is that lesbian privilege? Or is it maybe that lesbians have certain characteristics that are more masculine in some ways?
Gay men make more than straight men too, right?
No,
Oh no.
no.
Oh, I thought that
This
was
is
true.
no, I don't
Okay.
think so. I think
Oh,
so. It's essentially about risk taking and assertiveness,
okay.
which gay men tend to be less likely to engage
Maybe
in.
it's gay, maybe it's gay couples
Yes,
that make. Okay, all right.
yeah,
Maybe that's the
yeah.
yeah,
But that's because there's two men.
yeah. So, yeah. Of course,
Yeah,
obviously.
and
Yeah,
less likely to have kids, obviously,
yeah,
as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
So we just started to kind of peel back the veneer of what the mainstream media tells you, and as soon as you look under the bonnet, you suddenly find out that a lot of these things that we are being fed by the mainstream media are absolutely not the way that they actually are.
Yeah.
And of course, YouTube is a big part of this. The Jordan Petersons, the Dave Rubins, the Joe Rogans of the world. They're creating a
All
space.
the people who are now who are getting labeled and
Yeah.
demonized. Did you see that New York Times piece? You must have.
Which one?
The making of a YouTube radical.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Where they had even like Philip DeFranco, and I was like, geez, there's people I know on this thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I was like, wow.
Well,
I'm,
I
I'm,
met, I met, I met Brett Weinstein a few weeks back,
yeah, yeah.
and he's in some quarters he's a Nazi. He's a
Oh
rat.
boy,
He's
I came to defend something he was saying
Mm,
yesterday morning, which he was thankful for. He responded to me, and he was, oh gosh, man, it's weird. I mean, he's a progressive, like he's a proper lefty as well.
yeah.
That's the thing. It's like he's not. I actually politically would disagree with him on a ton of stuff, but anyone who is reasonable and willing to have conversations, like I don't. Even if someone were like, there are even people who are like, not that I know personally, but I've come across people online who are like legitimately far left or legitimately far right, but they still maintain, like, they're not psychos. So I might disagree strongly with their positions, but they're still willing to have the conversations and have the debates and try to defend their ideas and all that kind of stuff. So it's like across the whole spectrum, I think I could, sit down and have a conversation with pretty much anybody who is who is still open to the
Mm,
idea of conversation. If it's someone like who's just, okay, I'm not gonna speak to anyone outside my bubble. I'm not gonna legitimize the enemy or whatever phrasing they want to use. It's like, because the thing is, as soon as conversation stops, I always say you've got three options. You can segregate, you can conversate, or you can fight. And these are the only three options to resolve problems. And I think what's I was about to say what's problematic. That's not a word. That's a word like it's not even in my vocabulary because it's been
mm,
ruined. But I think what a big problem is this is something Brett was commenting on, and I was also trying to explain it to people, is that by the silencing of the moderate voices in the middle, it actually can push people to the extremes, because people go, okay, well, no one in the center left or center right is talking about this issue or understanding my concern. And by me just having this concern, you're being called names and whatever. And then they're seeing people on the fringes who are saying, oh, okay, this issue is there. They're, for their own nefarious reasons, they're probably massively overblowing the issue. But people in the middle then go, oh, well, they're at least talking about it. And I think that's the problem with all this silencing of all these big issues, whether it's something to do with immigration, something to do with religion, or in the UK, something like Islam in particular, or whether it's to do with certain things around sex and gender, or it's like by silencing it, you push people to these fringes. And that's why I'm very much super pro free speech, almost like essentially a free speech absolutist. And I'm just like, look, these ideas, even the ones I don't like, even the ones I think are reprehensible, whether it's coming from the left or the right or the top or the bottom, like they need to be out there, because the ideas that do not stand, I do believe, can be defeated with better arguments.
mm,
And also just from a sake also just for the sake of empathy. You know what I mean? Like, there are people who have really fringe views that I really dislike, but I can understand. Some people would want to demonize me for even saying this, but I can get where they're coming from in their own worldview, A bit like how in have you seen the latest Marvel films like Endgame and Infinity War?
No, I don't watch those, but tell me anyway.
No? Okay, all right. So the main, do you know who Thanos is?
Yeah.
Okay, so Thanos's whole idea, basically, is he wants to wipe out 50% of all living beings in the universe, so that because his own planet was, the population expanded too quickly and they ran out of resources and loads of people died and it was horrible. So he wants to prevent this happening in other places. So he wants to wipe out half of the Earth's population.
So
So he's
he's
trying.
like a Green Party Nazi type thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So he wants to get all of the Infinity Stones, and then he can just literally vaporize half of the entire population. So his idea is wrong, right?
Yeah.
But everything he does in the film is motivated by this morality, right? So it's like in his framework, what he's doing makes complete sense. So you can empathize with it. It's not just he's evil and just wants to kill people for the sake of it. It's like, no, he wants to do it for what he considers a greater good, even though we all generally completely disagree with his methods. So that's why he's a really interesting character. It's the same in Black Panther. You've got this guy called Killmonger who, his motives are, he's a bad guy, but his motives are not just megalomania or evil or just being a complete psychopath. It's like there's a logic to it. It's just that some of those things he hasn't connected the dots correctly, if you see what I mean. And that's what I think is true of both the true far left and the true far right,
Yeah.
And I've spent a lot of time actually looking at the arguments and seeing what people are saying, and it's I think a lot of people don't want to do that, but for the sake of my own knowledge and trying to just understand the world around me, I think it's important to do that.
Well, yeah, you're intellectually curious. I think one of the interesting things about what you're talking about is that, particularly with the far left, I think the far left get given a little bit of sympathy that they don't deserve, because the idea is that they're coming from a good place.
Not
And
always.
well, but that is the narrative, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to protect people. They
Yes.
care about people. And my hesitation with that is always, well, look, the Soviet Union was created by people who had great intentions. I mean, I wrote a piece for Quillette about this, talking about how the Soviet Union was actually, in many ways, a brilliant society. Everybody had healthcare. Everybody had a really high standard of education. There was no ethnic tension, blah, blah, blah. All these great things. It's just a pity you had to kill 50 million people to make it happen, right?
Yeah.
And the idea that having good intentions justifies evil behavior is a problem. And that is a problem that we're facing now. But coming back to the point that you made about the fact that people are being pushed to the fringes, it's actually a self-fulfilling prophecy, because what happens is, let's say, take the issue of immigration in this country, right? Ordinary people try to raise immigration as an issue, right? And when you and I were at school, when I came to this country in 1995, 3% of the British public thought that immigration was a major issue. You know why? Because the level of immigration into this country was about 50 to 60,000 people a year, right? By the mid-noughties, 50% or close to 50% of the British public thought that immigration was a major issue. Why? Because in the Blair peak of immigration, more people had come under the Blair government than had come from 1066 to 1950.
Wow.
Right. So the reason people were concerned about immigration is because it was a major issue, because we had large numbers of people coming. And what happened is, instead of addressing that reality, anyone who was remotely even reasonable raising those issues was immediately dismissed as racist and bigoted.
Yeah.
And then what happens is, it's an issue that gets picked up by the far right. And then the people who were talking about immigration as racist go, well, look, it's an issue that the far right care about. Therefore, everyone who cares about it really was racist, really was xenophobic.
Yeah.
And that's why I generally feel like the work that you are doing and the work that I'm doing with Triggernometry and other people like us, who, in this stupid world where what you're allowed to say depends on your skin color or where you come from, we have that kryptonite. I've had so many people after my Good Morning Britain appearance talking about whether John Cleese was racist to say that London was become less English. I had so many people come up to me and go, I'm so glad you're saying it, because I wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, I get this, I get the same thing. I get the same thing a lot. I had a conversation with I don't know if you know Eric July. He's also He's also a musician from the States, but he's he's a black guy from Texas. He's like an anarcho capitalist. He runs like a podcast and stuff. He's like super duper, like super libertarian.
Mm.
And we had a really interesting discussion about that, about some of the issues amongst Black communities in America, certain things around gun control, about the fact that 90% of Black Americans vote Democrat, and all these things. And, we joked halfway through the thing. We were like, gosh, man, if we were two white dudes, this conversation,
Yeah.
like this conversation would be used as like evidence of us being like some super crazy. And it's amazing. It's like, yeah, in an ideal world, the argument and the facts being espoused, the person's skin color or their gender or whatever who's saying it shouldn't matter. But because we're in this current state where these are the things that people care about, that legitimizes or delegitimizes an argument, it's like, well, you know what, bro, we may as well use this to our advantage and not back down and not cower and say what we feel needs to be said in order to help people for the greater good. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is becoming increasingly important, which is minorities or immigrants speaking out about these issues and going, hold on a second. These are the facts.
Yeah.
And you can't call me racist, because in your world, you can only be racist if you're white. Or you can only be xenophobic if you're indigenous, right? Or whatever. And you're kind of using their system against them on the one hand. On the other hand, it does worry me. It worries me that that is the world we live in, where even those of us who abhor identity politics, like you and I, we are still forced to play into it. We are still, you and I would not have the platform that we have if not of our background.
Yeah,
it's true. Just a fact.
Yeah, it would be a lot harder to talk about certain things without certain I mean, some of these accusations still get levied our way, even when they don't make any sort of sense. Yeah. But I think it's a lot easier. They can't stick, right? If somebody tries to call me a white supremacist or not, like it can't stick, because it's just like they just look completely stupid. Yeah. Right. So yeah, I mean, if that's what it takes, then I'll use that. I'll use that to my advantage.
It's a shield that you can use, because when I was on Good Morning Britain a couple of weeks ago, the conversation was John Cleese said that London has become less English, or I think he said it wasn't really an English city anymore. And I said to him, well, look, I don't know if it's not English, but it's certainly way less English than it was. Right. I mean, let's look at the facts. 42% of the people who live in London are foreign born, like me. Right. And they just couldn't process it. And I said, okay, forget about like immigrants and race and everything else. What about if 50%, if half of the people who lived in London were Scottish, right? Other white people, but immigrants, right? Would London be less English? And you just watch their heads explode. It's like they've never considered this.
That's gone quite viral, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. I think it's like 400,000 views on on YouTube now. Yeah.
Okay, I caught it.
Comedian destroys 3 social justice warriors.
Yeah, I love the title. You went for the full YouTube bait.
Well, our producer kind of edited it down with all the kind of sound effects and all the rest of it, which I'm not a big fan of clickbait, but it needed to be done, I think, on this particular one.
After the Konstantin Kisin Thug Life videos are coming soon.
Yeah, I think if they keep bringing me on TV, I think those will be coming. But the thing is that I think if I was a British white person saying that, I wouldn't have even got the opportunity to articulate the factual point.
No.
Because I would have been shut down before then. And this is kind of the small leeway that you and I have and people like us have. It's interesting to me that, like people like Dave Rubin, for example, he's a gay guy, right? So that gives him a bit of a shield as well. You know what I mean? Like, I know a lot of people in this world who have that little bit of a shield, because I guess you wouldn't even get to that point if you were just a straight white guy.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's very strange. I mean, so I take it obviously you're very outspoken on this, and you're working to sort of do your little bit to turn the tide, shall we say. So where do you think this goes? Do you think it gets better from here? Do you think it gets worse and keeps getting worse? Do you think it gets worse and then gets better? What are your predictions? I don't know, for the next, I mean, because this stuff has happened, I want to say, in the last 5 years. This is in the last 4 years even. This is really, really ramped up. So where do you think it goes from here? I mean, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, I mean, it's looking kind of like, whoa, it could go all the way there. It could go all the way there. People might heed the warning signs and make sure it stays in the middle? What do you think?
I think that we are now at a point where probably halfway through it.
Mm,
I think it's going to keep getting worse. And it's interesting to me that the clip of you doing that deadlift went viral, because I've always said that the trans thing is the thing that's going to break the intersectionality agenda.
mm,
And the reason is that most people don't care about free speech. Most people don't care about white privilege. Most people don't care about the gender pay gap as a concept,
yeah.
right? People go to work, they bring up their kids, they try and put food on the table, they try and make money, they try and progress in their life, they try and have meaningful relationships. The vast majority of people are not interested in this,
Yeah.
right? But when you start saying to people that a biological male not only needs to be called a different pronoun, which most people look, most people are eminently reasonable and compassionate.
Mm-hmm.
If someone says to me, you know what, I self-identify as a woman now, please call me she.
Yeah. You're not gonna go out of your way to,
No.
you know.
What the hell do I know? We've had the transgender woman on the show talking about, feeling like she is a woman from the age of 5.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if that is her experience, and if maybe something, as she was saying, something happens in utero where you get bombarded with the wrong hormones and something happens and that is just how you feel, I'm all for compassion for those people.
Mm-hmm.
But the moment you start putting it out to the general public, that if your 7-year-old says, hey, mummy, maybe I'm not as much of a boy as I thought, or whatever, you start to have to give them hormone blockers.
Mm.
Or that a woman being beaten up in a cage by someone who 2 years ago was a guy,
Yeah.
who's gone through puberty, who
Yeah.
has
And competed as a guy.
and competed as a guy, right? Uh, Once you start putting that proposition to ordinary people, I mean, I've done it. I've
Yeah.
talked to people who are not into this thing, who
Yeah.
don't know anything about it, and I've said it to them. Their eyes become the size of plates. They just go, "What? Ordinary people don't know about this stuff yet, Zuby.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
the
I
thing."
know.
And once it gets into the general public, that is where you're going to start to see a lot of genuine pushback. So I think this is going to continue to get worse
Yeah. I think that one.
because
I also think, sorry to interject.
no, yeah,
I also think the other thing is, I don't even like to saying it, but you're starting to see certain people and certain organizations and stuff start to push for like normalization of pedophilia.
mm,
Like this is something I'm seeing now. And you've got certain people who are trying to lump it, they're kind of trying to slide it into the LGBT thing, so that if you are critical of a 12-year-old boy twerking at a pride parade, that you are now against gay people, right? They're trying to conflate all of them together with no delineation. And I also think that's another hill that people will die on. Like when children, whether it's with the trans thing or whatever else, when children start getting involved in this stuff, that's when I think that people will draw a very hard line.
mm. You're already starting to see a lot of fractures in the intersectionality thing. Like we have the school in Birmingham,
Mm-hmm.
a Muslim school, which is trying to ban teaching about homosexuality,
Didn't
and
see
you
that one
can,
coming.
yeah. Well, everybody did. Everybody was paying
Yeah,
attention.
yeah, yeah.
Coming. I know what you mean.
Yeah, yeah,
Everybody saw it, but the general public didn't.
yeah, yeah.
And suddenly the general public are going, wait, we're being told that Muslims are the suppressed group, and yet here they are imposing their view on another oppressed group.
Mm-hmm.
And which one do we side with? And a lot
Yeah.
of people's brains explode at this point, because it's like that 2 + 2 = 5 thing.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
It's a really interesting one. I mean, because I myself, I grew up in Saudi Arabia,
Mm,
right? I grew up in the Middle East. I grew up in a place similar to yourself, without this right to free speech, and essentially a theocracy. There's no delineation. There's no separation of church and state. What is in the Quran is the law. And I mean, it was a good place to grow up in many ways, but I think it's given me a very interesting perspective in a lot of ways. And one thing I've always found fascinating, like one thing I sometimes morbidly say, although it's not really, it sounds like a joke, but it's not really a joke. But I sometimes wonder if the Western world's own tolerance is going to be its death knell,
mm,
right? Because it's one way. Okay, so if you're in Saudi Arabia, you can't build. There's 0 churches in Saudi Arabia, 0. You cannot build a church there. You cannot if you're a Christian or any other religion, you can't, you can't bring a Bible into the country. You can't go out on the street and, do street preaching or anything like that. You'll be arrested immediately, right? So, you obviously can't drink alcohol. You can't eat pork, even if you're not a Muslim. Like, you follow their rules, which is fine. Like, I totally respect that. I'm like, look, they want to keep their country and their rules their way, and they've got a right to do that. But it's amazing to me how people in the UK and other countries are completely bending backwards, despite it being totally one way, right? That's the thing that always I find quite remarkable and admirable in one way, but in another way, I'm kind of like, well, how far are you going to go with that, right? You've got all mosques popping up all over the UK, all over Europe, but in the Islamic world, no churches are being built, and it's not even allowed. So it's one of those things that, again, this is very like taboo topic, but as someone who's sort of seen both of those sides, I'm a bit like, well, tolerance is great. Like, I get that, but are people aware that you can't kind of do the same thing over there? So how are you going to reconcile these two things? Like, I don't even know the answer. I know what some people who are super hardline would say. I don't necessarily think that's even the correct answer, but it's like, well, again, these are discussions that people don't want to have because they're uncomfortable. But I think, well, these are serious issues when you're looking at the demographics, you're looking at the changes of demographics, and numbers rising, numbers going down. And it's like, well, you've got to look decades into the future.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be super alarmist here or anything like that, but these things do need at least honest conversation.
I think that the honest conversation that we're not having in the UK as much as we should be is about integration. It's about the fact that we're a welcoming country. We accept people from all over the world. We don't care what your skin color is. But what we do care about is that you come to the society and you accept the rules of this society.
Yeah.
And we have to have a set of national values that everybody gets behind. And if you have communities that think that they can set their own values, that if you have communities that think they can segregate themselves, if you have communities that want to have their own system of law, that is not compatible with a Western liberal democracy.
No, it's not.
And so the rules, in my opinion, have to be that if you want to come to this country, the unspoken or maybe even spoken deal is you become British. You become British. There is none of this, oh, we've got our own culture. 500,000 Russians turn up, box off a piece of London and go, and here, we're just going to speak Russian and eat Russian food and have Russian customs.
Yeah.
You can't have that.
Yeah. So here's, well, I think I literally just lost my train of thought there. What was I going to say? Oh no, okay, I remember. So why do you think it is? I mean, perhaps it's historical reasons and some aspects of guilt, but why do you think it is that these rules, so like I agree with you that if you're in a different country, you should respect their laws and their rules, and especially if you're there long term, I think you should learn the language. I think you should do your best to integrate. It doesn't mean you have to lose your own identity or culture or anything like that, but you can integrate well and do all that. But and people generally agree with that for most countries, right? Most people would be abhorred of the idea of, I don't know, people going to China or to Japan or to Nigeria and kind of creating their own little enclave and then trying to force the natives to bend to their will. So why is it that people think it's kind of like okay for other countries to behave like that, but then if a country like Hungary or Poland kind of wants to do the same thing, they get the shouts and screams of xenophobia and hatred and bigotry and racism and all that?
Well, I don't think it's a question that anyone's really got a genuine answer to, but I think partly it's about the fact that we have a generation of young people, particularly now, who are just not educated. They're not educated because they've maybe never traveled. They probably haven't read history. They don't understand how things are in other countries. They've just been told that tolerance is our strength, that diversity is our strength, without understanding what any of those words mean. And it's a kind of fear of being perceived as xenophobic or racist. that means that we can't have any of these conversations. And we started to, by the time it was too late. Like David Cameron, our former prime minister, said multiculturalism has failed. Angela Merkel said that multiculturalism has failed before letting in 1 million Syrian refugees, right? And the thing with all of that is the problem is not even the level of immigration, although there are points at which having too much immigration is a problem.
Yeah.
The problem is that you don't say to people who come to this country, welcome, here are the rules. You learn the language, you become British. And I probably would disagree with what you said, that I think that maybe in the first generation you don't lose your own culture. But this is how I've always felt about it. I'm from Russia. I will never cease being Russian because I grew up there. I have, in some ways, Russian mentality. My humor has a Russian sense to the element to it, right?
What's a Russian sense of humor?
Very dark. So I will never necessarily lose that. But if my grandchildren, should I have any, thought of themselves as Russian, I would consider that a failure on my part.
Okay, I get what you mean.
And a failure on my children's part to integrate them into the society.
Yeah.
I personally believe at the end of the day that if you want to come to a country and you want to become part of that country, you want to get a passport, you want to settle down here, you want to have children here and grandchildren here, your job is to integrate those people into the society so that your grandchildren, they might remember that you were Russian, but they feel British.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I get that. I think what I maybe I could have worded better is people can be more than one thing, right?
Sure.
So just like myself, both in terms, even in terms of like my nationality and citizenship, I'm a national and citizen of the UK and also of Nigeria, right? Same with everyone in my family, and we do very much have a Nigerian identity, and I can go back to the country and like have stuff there, but I'm also British. People think I'm American, but it's kind of like it's like I think this is something that certainly I think the people who are like more far right kind of miss is that people can be more than one thing. So yeah, you might be black, but you can also you're a black, but you're also I'm black, but I'm also a Christian. I'm also British. I'm also Nigerian. I've also got my political. I've got there's a lot of things. I think both extremes. I think their biggest failing is trying to boil people down to just a single identity, right? Just a single identity. So you are just. It doesn't matter that you're Russian. It doesn't matter that you're an immigrant. It doesn't matter that where you grew up. Right? You're a straight white male. Right? It's like all these other things kind of go out the window. And then again, on the other side, it's like, okay, well, they lose all the nuance, and it's just like, okay, well, you're non-white. And it's like, okay, yeah, but somebody can be. I think this is probably what someone could have said in that TV debate that you had about the John Cleese comment, but nobody articulated well because they were just screaming, is that, maybe a decent point someone could have made is that, there's, there is obviously someone can be like ethnically English or like Anglo-Saxon or whatever, but someone can also be totally British or very English despite coming from a different background. Just, I don't know, like nuance gets lost in all these things. As soon as the emotions, ramp up past a certain level, like people just lose their ability to be reasonable.
But my point about integration, Zuby, is that if your grandchildren thought of themselves as Nigerian, and supported the Nigerian national team over, say, the English national team, to me, I personally would consider that a failure of integration.
That's interesting. I wouldn't. I wouldn't. Like in the World Cup, I support both.
Yeah, but but my point is your first generation, right? Or second in your case.
I guess second. Yeah. But I think even when my kids, I mean, I don't have kids yet, but my siblings do, and they'll wear the Nigerian kit and whatnot. It's like they're just both. They're just both. They're British and they're happy to be British. But
I think that maybe with something like Nigerian, it's one thing. But when you're talking about certain cultures which are far more
less compatible, maybe
not so much compatible, but which are much more specific about the things that you can and can't do and should and shouldn't believe, then that becomes a problem because it creates a values conflict between the host society and the people who've come.
I get what you mean. Yeah.
So if you had a belief system that essentially meant that you didn't believe in democracy, I'm not saying that there are cultures that do, but just take a hypothetical
Gotcha.
example. If you felt that the best way to manage society is through socialism, because let's take my example, right? If I felt that growing up in the Soviet Union, socialism was so brilliant that actually we don't need democracy. What we need is to overthrow democracy and create socialism. And for 4 generations, everyone in my community taught that to their kids.
I'm kind of laughing because it's not immigrants who are pushing for that for that
Right,
specific thing.
right.
Yeah. So that
Well,
might be a
just
more
to make it
ideological
about
thing.
me rather than offending some other group, right?
Yeah.
To me, that would be a failure of integration, because what it says to me is you have come to a country that has a certain national identity, and instead of adapting and incorporating yourself into that, you've brought your own values, and you're trying to reshape society according to the thing that you left.
Yeah.
I mean, if you really like socialism, go and live in China or in Venezuela or wherever, or Cuba, right? Or if you really want to live in an Islamic state, there are plenty of places you can do that, right? So I think it's about all of us who've come here, who are second generation or whatever, just understanding that there is such a thing as British identity, there's such a thing as British culture, there is such a thing as British values, and either you adopt those, or maybe you need to pick a country to live in that suits your values better.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the time, we're gonna have to wrap up soon, but what you just said brought an interesting question to mind, which is, who defines those values? So I think, if we talk about British values and culture, I've got I could probably think of a few things that I would consider in that, but I think we're living in this weird time where it's not really known well who defines or decides that now.
Well, the thing is that a culture isn't something that you can just like write down as a law and then everyone goes, yeah, we accept this. But I think what we need to start looking at is how do you create a sense of community out of what have essentially become disparate, separate communities? A lot of people talk about the need for some kind of national service where essentially it's this thing that pulls people together from different communities to engage in joint activities, to get to know each other, to understand that we're not as different as we keep thinking that we are. A place where people come together as young adults maybe, or as older kids, and learn, to work with others, to engage with people from other communities. It's very difficult to define British identity because of how embarrassed people have been for probably 30 or 40 years to talk about it.
Yeah.
But there are certain things that make this country what it is. Just like with America, it's a lot easier. There's the American dream, and everybody kind of knows what that is, right? And also because they have a written constitution that was written very recently in historical terms. There are certain things that are enshrined in it that essentially all Americans kind of have to accept, even if they don't like. The freedom of speech thing is so much easier to discuss in America because you have the First Amendment.
Yeah. It's enshrined. But in
It's
America, they're now having this problem because you've got people who just don't care about the Constitution, don't care about the amendments, and they're trying to uproot their own. And these are Americans, and it's weird. It's almost like the enemy's kind of on the inside, right? It's not coming from the outside. You've got people there who are coming out of the university system who are trying to do what you said, install socialism, restrict the First Amendment, take away the Second Amendment. And some of them are a little bit sneaky about it, but some of them are pretty frank and open about like, yeah, no, I don't care about that. It was written by some dead white males and we should rip it up.
But that's what I love about America. Every time I've been to America, I've tried to go to a museum about American history, or I went to one in Philly, which was absolutely brilliant. And you just get the sense of it's a society that is constantly debating what the rules should be.
Yeah.
And I understand that there are extremists on both sides, but that is much better than what we have sometimes in this country, where we're afraid to talk about the real issues. And instead of having that debate, what we do is we just keep it all suppressed. And then we just throw milkshakes at people when they don't agree with us. And this is one of the things I wanted to say, which does worry me about what's happening, is language is important. This is one of the things I agree with the left and maybe even the radical left about. Language is important. And the reason it's important is that one of the things we've seen in this country and elsewhere is if you label your political opponents as Nazis, at some point you actually start to believe it.
Yeah.
And so do other people. Now, let's imagine for a second that I actually thought you were Hitler, right? I actually thought that you were a budding Hitler. I would be, it's that eternal question. If you could go back and shoot Hitler, would you? Well, of course you would. Most people would say they would, right? So now I am in my head entitled to shoot you.
Yeah.
Morally
obliged.
Morally obliged. I have to. It's my duty, right? And I mean, for now it's milkshakes. But if this way of talking continues, you will see people, and I hate to say this, and I hope it doesn't happen. I hope I'm wrong about this. But if this continues, you will see people being physically attacked and then killed.
Yeah.
Because if you continue to label people as evil enemies, eventually you start to believe it. Eventually other people start to believe it. And eventually there will be someone who's crazy enough to feel justified in doing it. Yeah, that's the danger.
It is dangerous. There are a lot of dangers with this stuff. I do think like on a, I think on a level, like everyone who's kind of having these conversations, and, you mentioned guys like Joe Rogan and Dave, I think what they're doing is far more important than most people realize. And I think also because it empowers other people to be inspired and do the same things and have those conversations, talk across party lines, and just, keep the, it's like a pressure valve, just like release the pressure so that it doesn't just get, otherwise, again, the fringes will dominate, because those are the people who tend to be the most vocal, the most active, right? There's no such thing as a centrist activist. Right?
Yeah.
Like there's no one who's just in the middle who's like, it's the people who are, very polarized. So,
but it is starting to happen now. I kind of think of myself as a centrist activist.
I guess so. Yeah, I guess so.
I mean, we're trying to, essentially what we're doing with Triggernometry is a British version of the Rubin Report or Joe Rogan. We're trying to create, and we are really the only ones that are doing it. We're creating a space where these conversations can be had. They can be long enough that the conversation can be, you get a chance to say what you actually think, kind of like what we're doing now.
Yeah.
And a lot of people come up to, both my co-host Francis and I, we get loads of people coming up to in the street going, "It's a great thing you're doing. Keep doing it."
Good.
But I can't tell anyone about it.
Yeah.
So the majority of society, I think, is in that place.
Yeah. I always say that, man, if there should just be maybe one day of the week where everyone just decides like, okay, like everyone's just going to break this matrix on this day.
Yeah.
And then like that silent majority, everyone just speaks up. Everyone will be protected because everyone else is speaking up. And like, we can just, end this and like, just kind of come back to normality.
Yeah.
But, awesome, bro. Well, I'm looking at the time, man.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
No, absolutely, bro. Before we jump off, let people know where they can find you online and also where they can check out your podcast.
So I'm on Twitter at Konstantin Kisin, just my name. And we're at TriggerPod on Twitter and on YouTube as well. Just put in TriggerPod or Triggernometry. And we've got interviews with all kinds of fascinating people. As I said, evolutionary psychologists. We try to balance it up, actually. I mean, one of the greatest difficulties in doing the podcast is getting enough left kind of woke people on. You can get old school lefties who are kind of, the old former laborite kind of working class people. We've got loads of those.
But they're right wing now.
Yeah, they're right wing now. So we've got a bunch of those. We've had big names on the show like Douglas Murray, Peter Hitchens, Jeffrey Miller. We've had you on, obviously. We have a really interesting selection of guests. So check it out if that's something that, if you're interested in genuine conversation that's unfiltered, relaxed, and people get a chance to say what they actually think.
Awesome. I do recommend it. I can honestly say it's the best interview I've ever done and ever had. So thank you for that. Awesome. Konstantin Kisin, thank you so much for joining the Real Talk with Zuby podcast, and we will talk soon.